add some more slides after we have time.
Sorry. I know we're over time. I'll try and rattle through. I have a lot of slides as well. I think the slides are going on our website, aren't they? So we can give you the gist of it. And I think I'm just going to talk about the possibility of taking the biogas and putting it into the gas grid instead of making electricity. So I'm going to try and give you a sort of flavour of what that looks like, what the issues might be. Forget about all of that. We work on a project which is the first biomethane to grid project, which was completed October last year, which took gas that was being flared at the Didcot sewage treatment works at Thames Water, as you can see on this slide here, and it's now being injected into the gas grid. It's a very small amount, and it's really a pilot project. It's unlikely that projects of that size would ever be economic, and I'll explain that a little bit later on. So what happens at Didcot is that if you can imagine people who go to the loo in Didcot, I'm not an AD person, but 21 days later it'll have made gas, and at the moment, well, that gas was just flared off. So what happens now? We capture that gas. It doesn't go to the flare. It goes through a plant and goes into the gas grid. And the plant looks like this. The digesters were obviously there already. So was the gas bag. And then there was a flare, and so every so often the gas bag would empty its gas through the flare. So the new plant that's been installed is there's three main elements to it. The first bit is the green bit here with the towers. That's a plant to remove hydrogen sulfide from the gas, to remove the CO2 from the gas, and to dry the gas. So biogas, wet biogas goes into that, and when it comes out, you've basically got something that looks about 95% methane, a little bit of CO2, a little bit of oxygen, a little bit of nitrogen. Now that gas then, it cannot go into the gas grid because the calorific value is too low. And I can very simply explain that, is that if I live near Didcot, I get gas from, my gas starts off in Qatar as LNG, comes to Milford Haven, goes into the gas grid, and when it comes to my house in Didcot, every metre of gas that I burn has about 39.5 megajoules of energy. So I pay by the volume, really. My meter reads a volume. So every time I have a meter, I pay and I get 39.5 megajoules. If this gas went in straight from this plant, it would have a calorific value of about 37.5. So that would mean, really, it would still be legal, it would burn in my appliances, but I'd be paying for 39.5, but only getting 37.5. And so it's bad enough that I live next to Didcot sewage works without me sort of being diddled out of 8% of my gas. So I think if you ever wanted to go down this path, and if people ever found out that if they live near one of these plants they've got 8% increase in gas bill, you'd never get planning permission. So I think the industry's sort of accepted that you have to add propane. So the other thing that happens over here is a little bit of propane gets added to the gas. Well, I say a little bit, anything between about 5 and 10% propane. So once you've now got the gas, it now looks, in terms of calorific value, like normal grid gas. You then have to sort of go through a process of measuring the contaminants to make sure there's no H2S, that it is dry, and it's got the right CV. And that's what happens in one of these other buildings here. So basically that's it. And I think it's actually very, very simple. I think what's interesting is these plants at the moment are actually quite expensive. I would say very expensive. And the reason is there's probably only been about 100 examples of biomethane to grid projects really in Europe and North America. So it's not a very mature market. So if you looked in the CHP plant we'd seen before, if you look at a Jenbacher CHP, it's a very sophisticated piece of plant. And you'd think it must be worth miles more than this, because there's not really anything to this. But it isn't, because GE sell a lot of the Jenbachers, and so it's no longer a development machine. So even though it's very sophisticated and very clever, it is not very expensive. And I think where we are with these type of plants, we're at the start of a journey, and in the next few years, as there is innovation in this sector, the price of these things will come down. This just shows the propane. Once you've added you've removed the CO2, you've dried the gas, you've removed the H2S, you've added the propane. At the moment, there is a lot of cost to then get it into the gas grid. The grid round here is owned by National Grid, And National Grid are incredibly supportive of these type of projects. So if ever you wanted to do one, they'll tell you where your grid is and what the capacity of your grid and how you need to go about doing it. But they are slightly fettered at the moment in that all these bits of kit that you see in this photograph come out of regulations which are really set by, in the most part, Ofgem. And they've not been adjusted to be fit for purpose for biomethane. And I can give you several examples. You measure something, hydrocarbon dew point, that costs £50,000 a year, but you can show by analysis that there isn't any hydrocarbons other than methane and propane. So a computer would tell you what that is. You measure total sulphur all the time, £50,000. You don't need to do that because the sulphur is in the form of hydrogen sulfide. You have to have a battery room. So that when gas first came into Bacton in sort of 1968, computers hadn't been invented. So they said, if we lose electricity, we'll be in a mess. We better have a room full of batteries. So Didcot has a room full of batteries. Even though most computers these days, you switch them off, and when you switch them back on, they still remember all the data, don't they? Another £50,000. So, and I could go on. You know, you're supposed to have a heated room. So there's a whole load of stuff, which means that this last bit would cost you £500,000 or £600,000, and it is not worth that. It is not worth that. It is not right that it should cost that. But at the moment, it does. But although National Grid in particular are trying to reduce those costs. There's another project not far from here, Adnams Brewery. They've done a joint venture with a company called Biogroup. Again, takes food waste, puts it through a different type of technology. This one's a cryogenic technology which basically chills the biogas, and as you chill it, first of all the water drops out, then the H2S, then the CO2. And so you still meet the specification for the grid, still needs to probably add propane, but it's a different way of doing it. And what the attraction for this particular customer was, in theory, liquid CO2 you can use to grow algae, which could then make more biogas. So I'll give you a few slides. I've mentioned the biogas cleaning upgrading. There are three main technologies I think you'll find. If you look around, there's 100 plants in Europe, and I think about sort of 95 are either water wash, which is basically using CO2 will be absorbed in water, and that's basically what's happening with this technology. There's another technology which is chemical wash, which is when you hear about people talking about carbon capture and storage for like a big coal-fired power station, it's basically this technology. The CO2 bubbles through an amine, and the amine grabs hold of the CO2. It's very efficient. It's a very effective way of removing CO2, but you do need quite a lot of heat to then drive off the CO2 because you get chemicals full of CO2, and then you have to sort of boil it off. But it's a very, very efficient technology. Another one is to use pressure. And the pressure and the water ones, basically, both of them, the input energy is in the form of electricity. So the first thing you do with the plant, with the gas, is compress it to sort of 10 bar. And it's that electricity that you've used that really is the driving force for the removal of the CO2. So those are the three main technologies. And you'll find there's some very good websites. I refer to one here, Task 37. Have a look, if you're interested in this, have a look on their website and download some of their reports because it's very, very good. Give you an idea of the costs and the type of technology. I'll rattle through the propane because I've sort of mentioned it before. Really, I think it's a significant point. Not much you can do about it. You just have to accept it as an operating cost. And I think certainly the Renewable Energy Association, we made that point to DEC, and I think DEC accepted that. So when the RHI was announced last week, it was higher than it was before to give allowance for the propane. Because what's happening with propane, just to be clear really, what's happening is at the moment the oil price is very high. Oil prices, everyone knows that, oil price is up here. And the propane price is linked to the oil price, so propane is very high. Prior to the Japan thing last week, the gas price was very low. And it no longer linked at all to the oil price. It's gone up a little bit the last few days, but it still is about half the price. So a lump of energy in the form of oil will cost you twice a lump of energy in the form of gas. That's why if anyone's near the gas grid, everyone in Britain is on gas. No one's on oil anymore. But what you're doing with the propane, you're buying the propane at the oil price, and you're selling it effectively at the gas price. So you are losing a lot of money on that. So that's the key to minimise the amount of propane you need to add. The B2G plan is the thing to measure the gas quality, to add the smell, all these things I talked about. They are very expensive at the moment. They should not be. And I think Ofgem have agreed with DEC to start a review process probably next month. And hopefully in a couple of months, the gas grid companies, of which NG, National Grid in this area, and the other ones, will agree a new protocol which will dramatically reduce these costs, because they're high for no good reason. There's no customer benefit. It's not like on the other side you can say that customers get something better. It just is a transition issue. We've had the regime written for big fields from the North Sea, and we need to adjust it for anaerobic digester plants in East Anglia. Connection to the national grid. In this area, it is National Grid who have the grid, and if you get in touch with them and give them an address, they'll tell you where the pipes are that are near your site, and they'll do that very quickly. But more importantly, they'll tell you if the pipes have the capacity, because it's a little bit at the moment. It's a little bit black and white. If you have a pipe near your farm, it might just be low pressure, so you can't put any gas in, because if you imagine the gas going into the pipe, if you're putting it in, someone has to be taking it out, because otherwise there'd be too much in the pipe. So if the demand on a pipe is 200 metre cubed an hour, the most you can put in it is 200 metres. You can't put 300 metres, because obviously the pressure would rise, 300 going in, 200 going out. And what you find is obviously a lot of areas are just not suitable to have gas into the grid, just because there isn't enough demand in summer, which is, using that gas. There is a way forward, and we're doing a project with National Grid and another company, which is looking at installing compressors in the grid. So in that model of the world, wherever you put your gas in, you could put it in, and maybe 5 or 10 miles away, National Grid would pump the gas up to a higher pressure tier, which is a very efficient way of getting energy to the market, because that compressor to pump the gas, if you like, uphill, would only run in the summer nights when there's no demand. In winter, you wouldn't run at all, because the gas would go in and be absorbed. And I explained this to my wife, and she said, well, that's obvious. And I said, well, it isn't obvious. We gasmen, we've been around 100 years, and no one in the world has ever done that, because gas always comes in at high pressure and does this. She said, well, it's obvious to me. So it's obvious to my wife. I get it. My 10-year-old gets it. And I think National Grid get it now. So I think, but it would be a very powerful thing if they could start to invest in little compressors to pump the gas into the grid. And when you think about it, it is pretty obvious now. Going back to National Grid, if you do this doesn't cost a lot. I mean, I probably shouldn't say what it costs, but it's probably only about £2,000. They'll do a very good study of all the issues. And I think if you are considering it, then it's well worth having that, because they'll tell you about the capacity and the costs of all these things. Ultimately, you need a couple of agreements with them. One which governs things like capacity, which is important, and gas quality, and another will say who's building what. And I think these are all sort of in play with the industry. They're not really set yet. They're set for large offshore gas fields. There is a willingness to modify them and make them something that wouldn't be horrendous if they were sent to a farmer in East Anglia, which they probably would be if they're designed for someone who's putting £1 million worth of gas an hour through. It's not really appropriate. So, but as I say, National Grid are very supportive. The final couple of things I want to talk about is green gas certificates. So this is a new